few years ago, I'm listening to commercial radio, and somebody on there goes, well, religious people don't care about the environment. And I screamed at the radio, because I know that's not true. And I'm thinking, you know, they're allowing 2 or 3 people to speak for all the religious people in the world. How dare they? So I put together a show for WBAI with people from 4 different faiths, and it was just a wonderful show. And it was delightful, and watching people of different faiths agree with each other, quoting scripture that agreed with somebody else's faith. It was so much fun, and I've been talking about that show ever since I did it. And I've talked about it with Steve, and in talking about it, it was sort of like, well, there's Environment TV wants more forums and more things, so let's do one on this. And because of Steve's connection with GreenFaith, I asked him to help me put this together, and here we are. And so the most obvious question is, how does faith form your environmental activism?
Hi, I'm Beth Ackerman, and I am with the Beloved Earth community, which focuses on climate change at the Riverside Church. Also, I am a GreenFaith Fellow, which is an environmental leadership program in religious communities. And finally, I'm a climate reality leader trainee, the Al Gore group. And as such, I am able to go around and give PowerPoint presentations about the climate, which I do with my scientist brother. He makes a great sidekick.
Hello, I'm Steve Knight. I'm a member of Church of the Holy Trinity. That's an Episcopal congregation on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. I also, like Beth, I am a GreenFaith Fellow. I'm the founder and the facilitator of a monthly group called Religious Communities for Divestment and Reinvestment.
I'm BrightFlame, and I'm a teacher, a writer, a priestess in the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft. I'm a lay scientist and lay naturalist as well, and I bring that work and my faith-based work to some extent into the education system.
I'm Ken Gale, and I'm the producer and host of an environmental radio show on WBAI FM and WBAI.org, and I've been doing that show for an awful long time now.
I'm Sharon Abreu, and I am from a Jewish family. I'm a member of Tikkun and the Network of Spiritual Progressives, 2 sister organizations that give me a lot of hope with their vision for a healed world. And I've been doing environmental education since 1993, since I joined Hudson River Sloop Clearwater in 1992, and started educating myself about climate change in 1999, and off I went. So I've been doing climate change education since 2000. And I'm a singer and songwriter, so my partner and I started a nonprofit called Earthlings, arts-based environmental education. And through music and theater and multimedia, we engage people on environmental issues and help people to kind of inspire people to become stewards of the earth.
Good question, Ken. And a complex one, because I think we all come at faith from so many different levels, both from our perhaps family of origin and our experiences growing up, which in my case, I grew up with a Presbyterian minister father who, he with my mother, the scientist, would go to the anti-war demonstrations in Washington, D.C. and bring us along. And I sort of conflate the 2 aspects of growing up in the church, the religious part and the activism part. That's sort of part of my DNA. And so now, as an adult, having reconnected with a more formal church environment, I'm excited to find a place like Riverside that's long been known for its social activism. And I've found some real interest in the people there who are as passionate about the creatures, the people who are going to be suffering more under climate change than the people who are more well-to-do, and it's a very rich vein, and I'm just honored to be in it. I think that's a good introductory statement for it.
There's a number of ways that I could approach this whole issue of how I got involved with the faith-centered side of environmentalism. I would like to just start by saying something about the time of year we're doing this, which is December. We Christians are awaiting Christmas. This is a holy season both for people from the Christian and the Jewish traditions. And just a word here about Christmas. You know, there's a lot of stuff about Christmas in the Bible that frankly I and most of the Christians I hang around with think is a bunch of fairy tale stuff, you know, the 3 wise men and all the business about the manger and following the star to Bethlehem and all of that. Not many people I know really believe that that literally happened. But what we do very much believe happened is the core of that story, which is what we call the incarnation. That God came down to earth in the form of a person. And the implication of all of that, of course, is theologically is that we don't believe in a God that is something abstracted, that is just something up in the sky. We believe that God exists in the materiality of the world around us. God is embodied in the world. And it's the incarnational aspect, I think, of my faith tradition that drew me very strongly to want to be a faith-centered environmentalist. So that's, at least here in December, that's where I'm coming from.
So much richness in what you both said. I have so many things popping in my head. Where to begin? First of all, we're coming up on the solstice or Yule, so it's a holy time in my tradition as well. In our wheel of the year, the midpoint between the fall equinox and the spring equinox. And I think all peoples of faith in some way represent the turning of this wheel, or different holy days sprinkled around the year through the seasons. For me, and what brought me to a witchcraft tradition is the sacredness of the earth, my knowing in my gut, knowing in my being that the earth is sacred. And that's my bottom line. That's what informs all of my work, whether it's my work in the field of education, whether it's my work teaching in my tradition, writing, and it's an immanence. It's something like what Steve was referring to about God coming down to earth. I believe my cosmology is that the goddess, which is what I call the energetic, widest, most unknowing from our point on this planet, the most vast mystery that's both the earth itself, the grain of soil itself, and the whole universe in its vastness is what I call goddess. And it's an immanence I'm part of, you're all part of. All beings, all trees, all rocks, all soil, all microbes, all fungi are part of this. And it's a very experiential thing for me. And so my purpose here, I've come to believe, is to help others connect that the earth is sacred and to feel that. And to me, that's the root of an environmentalism that can really take off.
Well, I really have always been the kind of person who likes to be walking outside, walking in the woods. And as I've gotten older, I lived in the city for quite a number of years, and I started feeling more of a need, that growing need to be in, quote unquote nature. And, because I didn't really ever used to think of myself as being a part of nature, really, but I did have things in my background that connected me to nature, for example, through Judaism. There are holidays that connect you with nature. There's Tu B'Shvat, which is the Jewish Arbor Day, the New Year for trees and the planting of trees, and understanding how you need to take care of trees, and in order to have them bear the fruit that you want, and Passover, the symbolism of all of the different things that you eat, which is it's a spring festival in part, or maybe more than in part, and just appreciating, well, why are we eating this? Why are we eating that? How is that connected to the earth, and to our lives? And there's other things too, like on Sukkot, and where you're eating in a little temporary outdoor shelter, and you're eating specific foods and specific fruits, and learning about the value of these, and really experiencing them, the harvest festival. So there's a lot that connects you to the earth, and also for me, a lot of it is really a sense of responsibility. On Yom Kippur, and it's the Day of Atonement, and you actually put your fist on your chest and you say, we have done this, and we have done that, and we have done this. And it doesn't matter whether you personally have done that. You take responsibility for the, if you want to say sins or mistakes, of the whole community. And I think that's how I feel about the planet. It's that it's my responsibility to be a steward, and to try to help other people to reestablish that connection, because we've lost it to a large degree. Hear somebody say, oh, I'm not into the environment. And I'm thinking, well, you are, And the more you know that, the better off you'll be, So, but I find a lot of solace in nature, and walking in the woods, and water and sunshine, and all of, just being part of, having really a sense of awe and wonder at the magnificence of what's around me.
Any comments or questions to anybody?
I'm enjoying this thread about nature, and my thoughts are not so much about my religious tradition, but almost like a mystical moment I had one time. I was working in a kind of activist way on a wetlands regulatory board in a Connecticut town, and we were reviewing an application that was very complex and really huge. So I kept walking the site over and over and over again, and I kept going into the wetlands, and one time, and you kind of like wear yourself out, and I think there was part of feeling worn out, and also just caring so much to try to make some impact to save what wetlands were there. And this may sound strange, but I was standing there, and I feel like I really heard a voice, and the voice said, "We are all one." And I said, "What?" I mean, of course, everybody's heard that statement, but it was a very strong message right then, and I think that has really kind of stayed with me ever since.
It's interesting that you say feeling worn out when you're in the wetlands. What I like to do is recharge by being out in as natural and as wild a place as I can be. And actually, I weave science a lot into my work, as do many of the people in my tradition, reclaiming tradition. There's a practice with a lot of studies behind it, the Japanese call Shinrin-yoku, that's walking through the forest, because the pheromones put out by the trees actually are necessary for our health. So it's a restorative and a healing thing to do. It actually increases the activity of your immune system lowers your blood pressure, lowers your stress level. It's not just, oh, it's relaxing to walk in the woods. There's science behind that. And so that's a really important aspect of us feeling ourselves plugged into this natural world in any ways that we can, to allow it to permeate our beings, you know, to get in through our pores and in through our nostrils and touching us with its energy.
I would just comment, if we're going to be speaking here about nature, I mean, being a city dweller here in Manhattan, it's sometimes a great challenge in terms of my environmental ministry to get people to take the concept of nature seriously when they're here in the city. I found that there's often a kind of prejudice about nature. Some people really believe that the only way you find nature is to get in a car and to drive to the Catskills or to get in a plane and fly to the Grand Canyon. And one point I try to make to people all the time is, remember, here in New York City, we're in an ecosystem here too. Obviously, it's very different than it would be out in the Catskills or at the Grand Canyon, but it's an ecosystem nonetheless, one that we've shaped in our own unique way, but we're still, you know, as we found with Superstorm Sandy 2 years ago, we're still very vulnerable to what Mother Nature does to us. And so I found part of it in working with religious people is to try to awaken their sense to how nature is not some abstracted thing out there 100 miles away. It's with you all the time. And I just wonder if anyone else has had that kind of challenge, and thought I'd mention that.
Well, we're at the Ethical Culture Society recording this, and we're overlooking Central Park. And I'm a birder, and Central Park is internationally renowned for the birds that fly through there. And you go to National Wildlife Refuge, and they got a species list of 200. Central Park has a species list of 300. There's an incredible amount of nature here. A new species of centipede was discovered in Central Park only a few years ago. We tend to not study the nature of New York City because people divorce themselves from it. And it's here. The effects of Sandy is a great way of making that is nature. Nature is not just the birds in the park. Nature is the climate, it's the weather, which are two different things. There's a lot of aspects, and we live with it. And it is a shame that there are people who divorce themselves from it. And they even, not just their everyday life, but even their spiritual life, they somehow have divorced it from the earth, which I personally have trouble understanding. Because I know people like you guys.
I grew up in Manhattan, and when I was a kid, the earth, the soil, the parks along the East River, I lived up in Washington Heights and actually by the Harlem River there, that was dirty. I was taught that was dirty. You don't go in there and you don't touch that stuff. And it took through my teenage into my early adult years to grow into this form of understanding and deep appreciation for nature. I think there still is a lot of that, as you mentioned, Steve, because I hear that from colleagues who are in education. But there's also a growing movement of, for instance, garden curriculum and environmental curriculum, and even the new, the Common Core and the next generation science standards that in the US are going to be the driving force behind K-12 curriculum, has a lot of standards about the environment and the natural world as a topic of deep understanding for students. So I'm encouraged by that and by colleagues who are trying to weave that under all topics in the school systems.
You know, I've been encouraged by some of the trends in environmental education, and I think it's really strange that we don't just have environmental education in the schools at this point, but I am encouraged because I've gone to some of the conferences of the North American Association for Environmental Education. I've met great educators there that are, you know, regular school teachers that want to bring environmental education into their classrooms. There's the No Child Left Inside program, which is really, it's a real program, and it's really going on, and it's a great thing. You know, that there is a growing consciousness about how we need to, you know, reconnect and appreciate, really understand what's happening around us and how we're part of the ecosystem. You know, how we affect it, how it affects us, how we can help to nurture it. And just gives me a lot of hope to see that that's happening in all different kinds of societies. It's happening in inner cities, you know. Not as much as I'd like to see, but it is happening. But it's going in the right direction, you know.
There's actually, here in New York City, there's a charity that is funding the building of greenhouses in elementary schools. I did a tour of one on the Upper West Side about a year ago, and what they're doing there is really quite extraordinary. The students are going into the greenhouse for their classes. They're participating in growing plants. They're using solar energy. They're harvesting water, rainwater. They're doing a hands-on interaction with the environment in a way that when I was in school years ago, you simply never did. Mm-hmm. So I find that to be a very encouraging sign.
Where I live on Orcas Island, where my partner and I are working with another nonprofit right in the San Juan Islands called Quiat. They oversee certain programs. One is called the Indian Island Marine Health Observatory. And so we're working with that organization and going into a 5th grade class with a teacher that is a very inspired teacher, very dedicated teacher, mm-hmm. and really likes multidisciplinary education. So we're going in there and we're doing a project on stormwater runoff. What is the pollution that is going from the parking lots and the roads into the sound, and how is it affecting the marine life, you know? And so there's really interesting science being done with the kids. That's what the Marine Health Observatory does. And then we do the arts part of it, where we have the kids writing about what they're learning and how do they feel about that, and what are their ideas for what we might be able to do to fix it. And one of the kids came in and she had written a song, and we were all so excited, and we performed it at an event. And you know, so we're getting them to kind of, on the one hand, process how they feel about this stuff, and encouraging them to express themselves about it, and kind of process what they're learning through that, and also to be able to present it for the whole community in a way that's fun and engaging. And it's just wonderful to be able to work with 5th graders in this way, because they're just great kids. They have a lot of great ideas.
The question that I always think about when I think of religion and spirituality and the environment is why it is that people like that guy on commercial radio can say and feel comfortable saying and get away with saying and have people agree that religious people don't care about the environment. How did that happen? How did such a big non-truth become accepted?
Don't you think it's related to politics? That's my first answer.
Yeah.
I don't have statistical evidence about this, but it seems as though one side of the political spectrum has a vested interest, and that they've aligned with larger corporate interests. And my suspicion is, I don't have proof, that it's trickled back down into the power base, which is related to some types of churches in the country. So I think you can say anything on TV and radio and get away with it. It's done every day of the week, and that's why it's a good thing that this program is going on to sort of counteract that. A related question I'm interested in is how can progressive religious people really harness the power and the passion that we do have, and you could see that we have it because 10,000 of us, and that's just a small number, were on the street just down the block from where we are today in September during the People's Climate March. So that was the largest group of religious people gathered ever on behalf of the climate in New York City. They're marching through the streets very effectively. And I was thinking about what the ripple down effect might have been from that, and because the climate talks are going on right now in Peru, building up to that, there was the sort of secretly arrived at negotiations between Obama and the Chinese premier. I'm feeling like he's hearing us. Maybe I'm a cockeyed optimist, but you know, I've seen him say several times, talking about the Keystone Pipeline, and how he's said some pretty strong things just recently about how, oh, it's a Canadian enterprise, it's going to benefit them and not our country, and it's just going to befoul our natural resources. And that sounds pretty clear to me that he's getting the message. And I'm not at all sure he would have gotten the message had not 350.org and Bill McKibben's group, et cetera, worked so hard to raise consciousness about that. So I think that in a similar way, the faith community is now getting lined up, getting ready to make an impact.
I certainly second that, what you said there. I think just for a moment to speak to the issue Ken raised about why do some people find it so difficult to think that a religious person could also be an environmental person. I think one thing we have to acknowledge here is that to a certain extent an anti-environmental attitude has been written or inscribed into people's interpretation of Scripture, at least within the Judeo-Christian tradition. You know, the very first book of our sacred Scripture for Christians and Jews, which is the book of Genesis, includes a passage that's generally translated to say man is meant to have dominion over the earth. That's the way that that word is usually interpreted. And that, for centuries, unfortunately, has been interpreted by many religious people to believe that we have a license to have unlimited mastery over the earth regardless of the consequences. I think that over the past 50 or 60 years, with the birth of the modern environmental movement, that's slowly begun to catch on with some parts of the religious community here in this country, but I think it's been a big inherent prejudice for us to overcome. And you know, I think with some sectors of the religious communities, you know, some faith traditions in this country still have not come around fully to really questioning that. So, I mean, I think we have to openly acknowledge that it's an ongoing challenge.
I'm glad you said that and not me, Steve, because that was in my head when Ken asked that. But I think it's true, and I think the work of Thomas Berry and others of his ilk to change the story, he talked about storytelling, and he said our older story, which didn't go back to the beginning of humankind. If you look at the work of, for instance, Maria Gimbutas, the anthropological archaeologist who did a lot of work on the Neolithic. But since the biblical age, the Judeo-Christian traditions at least, that dominion over earth was a really strong, compelling story. And the earth was dirty, just like the interpretation through a lot of the millennia, the past couple of millennia, is women are earthy and they're dirty, right? So, you know, they bleed, they give birth, ugh, you know? So things having to do with the earth were dirty, and we're better than that. We we don't even touch that stuff, and it's all resources for us to use. So that's the old story that, yeah, I think maybe not enough yet of religious communities have moved away from, but storytelling and telling this new story about the interconnectedness of us all and humans' place in the natural world as just being a part, not the dominating, predominant part. That's important, and it is emerging now.
Well, you know, when I got involved in, actually it was in 2003 with Tikkun and Network of Spiritual Progressives, which was just, that's the interfaith branch of Tikkun, you know, and it started in 2003, and I happened to go to a conference in DC, and I was so excited about it, because I really thought, you know, this is, like, I'm a Jewish person, but I don't like walls. I don't like, I'm different from you because I believe this, or because I have this practice, or whatever. I mean, I'm just, my personal thing is, I'm not really comfortable with that, you know, and so the interfaith group really appealed to me. And so you have people from every religion, every denomination. You've got some agnostics and even a couple of atheists, yeah, in this organization, you know, and people coming together to really say, we are people of faith, we have these values that we share with other people. And why is it that, you know, and going back to that, talking about the political right is speaking to people's values, you know, and speaking in terms of faith, and at the same time undermining those values in what's happening in the corporate world in a very significant way. Whereas the left, you know, and Rabbi Lerner talks about this because he was a social psychologist before he became a rabbi, and he did a lot of research on this all over the country. And, you know, whereas the left is not comfortable talking in terms of religion, you know, or faith or values. And the left is very up in the head and giving you good facts and why aren't we getting where we need to be? You know, it's not that people on the left don't have values, it's just they don't talk about them the same way. And so it's harder to connect with people. And so that's a real challenge for people on the left who, many people may have had a bad experience with religion, you know, or something where they found some injustice or something that they weren't comfortable with or something in the history or whatever, you know. You know, for me, it has something to do with being a woman, you know, in Judaism, and the mixed messages that I got growing up. You know, it's like, well, you can do this, but you can't do that. You know, you can learn this, but then you can't do that. And so, I don't like the walls, and so I'm really excited about seeing everybody come together. And I'm really encouraged by seeing groups popping up. You know, I had seen a issue of Mother Jones, and this goes back, I think, more than 10 years now. That had an article about evangelists that are concerned about climate change, and I'm going, yeah, finally, thank you, you know. But yeah, these things are happening, but you don't hear them on the news every day. You know, there's a group called Restoring Eden, you know, and I started meeting people from that group at an environmental conference. You know, there's COJL, which is the coalition of, it's a coalition on the environment in Jewish life. You know, doing a lot of great stuff, trying to reach out, trying to get communities that are not necessarily jumping in and becoming environmental stewards with both feet, helping them to see the connections and helping to see how it's really important that the faith community, you know, becomes, you know, rather than that image of dominion, be stewards of the earth. You know, really honor it.
Because I would just add, you know, one part of being a GreenFaith fellow is that we are expected to learn more not only about how our own faith tradition has a relationship to the earth, but also to look at other faith traditions. And, you know, I think my big takeaway from that, from spending time while I was a fellow looking at the environmental writings of people from non-Christian traditions, is just how, you know, this, a sense of we all have a responsibility to be stewards of the earth is written into every major faith tradition in this world. And it comes out, of course, in various ways in the different traditions, but it's there. I mean, it's tremendously empowering to learn about that. I don't know if you had the same response, you know, when you studied this, but it certainly moved me to have learned about that while I was a fellow.
Well, I was amazed. We did have a side trip to a Hindu temple, and I knew nothing about the Hindu religion. And I now know a little bit, and so the little bit that stuck with me is just how tremendously environmental that faith tradition really is, and also there's a big misperception about, oh, the Hindus have all these different gods, and they said no, it's actually just different faces of the same one God, and so I found that to be fascinating. I'm I'm interested too in what you were saying about the Thomas Berry news story, because we had David Corten come and speak to us one afternoon at the church, and he's doing a lot of thinking about not only about what's fair economically around the world, but how are we going to turn into the next story that's going to save humanity, if we are, you know. And he's really analyzed about the different traditions, the Judeo-Christian tradition, the Abrahamic tradition being one, as he sort of calls it, the God with the long hair sitting in the sky, you know, that kind of tradition. And then it's being superseded by the scientific approach, and how then there was such discounting of anything that was called Abrahamic, or, you know, had that aspect to it. And his conclusion was, well, we need to fashion a new story, because once you have a story as a people, that informs the path you go on. And so he's a strong believer in going back to an old sacred earth story. And you know, between that and a lot of reading that we've been doing about evolution and the universe's evolution and what part do we play in it, you know, I'm tremendously excited by those ideas, not to say that I know how it's all going to work out.
And really, a lot of people look, when they say we want to take on a new story, a lot of them look back to the indigenous stories of the earth. And that's witchcraft. I just want to say this, that witches really are the indigenous peoples of Europe, because there were indigenous peoples. Indigenous to me doesn't necessarily mean we lived in huts, or we lived in tents, or we lived in, you know, whatever, and we baked in this particular way, and we hunted for. It means that they knew the earth was sacred, and they listened to the earth, and they felt themselves part of the earth, and they were, as a part of the earth, they took on the responsibility of stewardship of the earth, by their nature, by their understanding of sacredness. And that was the way of life. So really, that's what we're all looking. You know, we here at this table and so many others around the world now are not looking to go back and live in tribal society necessarily, but we're looking for that story that maybe our ancestors worked with. And it might be our ancestors from 1,000 years ago, or 2,000 years ago, or 8,000 years ago. Or for some, it might be our ancestors from 50 years ago, because there are indigenous peoples who tend to be the frontline communities of climate change now. Something that was really brought home for me in the People's Climate March narrative, that the frontline communities, the global south, a lot of these indigenous communities are the ones who are going to be most affected by climate change more quickly. The ones who will be underwater, will have the tidal waves.
That's why I feel like, you know, I feel like I'm part of an earth community. You know, and David Corten actually talks about that. You know, he describes Earth moving towards Earth community. You know, he's got some great books, The Great Turning and Agenda for a New Economy, and other books. For me, I really see that. I see myself, and then I see my immediate community, and my wider community, and my global community, because what I do here doesn't stay here. It doesn't only affect me. It doesn't only affect my next door neighbor, you know. I really see what I do is affecting the whole world. How am I contributing to the suffering people in South America or in Africa or in Alaska, you know, where their towns are disappearing because of the melting, you know, the ice caps and the permafrost and the beach, you know, the erosion. It's just, how are my habits, my everyday habits that I don't even think about, that I've grown up with, how is that affecting these people? You know, it may not be affecting me. It may not be affecting me in an obvious way yet. You know, but how am I responsible? And to me, it's a big deal. You know, we had a thing in Washington, I live now in the Pacific Northwest, in the northwest corner of Washington State. And what's happening in the Pacific Northwest right now is we have become ground zero for oil and coal exports. You know, Peabody Coal wants to ship, you know, millions of tons of coal through Northwest ports to Asia, you know, to be burned there, and then all of that pollution will come back to us, and the global warming and all that. But they want to make, it's like this last gasp of make every last penny that you can and do it now, because pretty soon it's just going to be obsolete, it's not going to be economically viable, so shove it all through now, and that's what's happening. And it's right where we live. So where coal was not a problem for us a few years back, I had started doing, I do this show called The Climate Monologues, and I had started doing a couple of monologues from people I met from West Virginia that were struggling with mountaintop removal coal mining. Coal was not an issue for us where we live. We have like this much coal in our energy mix. However, now coal is a problem for us.
Yeah.
It's a big problem. And oil as well, Bakken crude, Alberta tar sands oil. We have oil refineries, and there are plans to expand them and use them as oil export terminals. And these would be these humongous tankers going through these narrow straits that are already crowded and treacherous. And what's the likelihood of an accident happening that would completely devastate the environment and tons of local economies?
Yeah.
You know, and we're fighting this, and thousands and thousands and thousands of people are fighting this, and writing comments for comment period after comment period after comment period, and spending thousands of hours of unpaid time, and to push back against this industry that wants these profits. And it's just, you know, I just consider it seriously immoral. Yeah. That this is even being considered, you know. But something really remarkably transformative is happening in response to this. And there is a new alliance that formed over the summer called the Not Samat Alliance. And it's one house, one heart, one prayer. Coming together of tribes, Coast Salish tribes, environmental groups, faith groups, community groups, and citizens that are committed to pushing back against all of this fossil fuel, you know, frenzy. And we actually had, the day before the climate march in New York, we were gathered at the Peace Arch Park, right on the border of Washington State and British Columbia. And it was so, I get chills every time I think about it, because it was so powerful. We had Canadians and the Americans, and the Canadians were standing on the American side of the park, and the Americans were standing on the Canadian side of the park, in two long lines, and facing each other, and committing to each other that we have each other's backs. You know? Because in Washington State we're being told, well, if you don't, you know, have this, these fossil fuels going out of your ports, it's just going to go to Canada and it's going to go out there. And the Canadians are like, I don't think so.
And that's happening on every continent. We have the exact same thing here with the fracking going on, and particularly Pennsylvania, the pipelines that are being put in like webs all through our earth to export terminals that are planned all along the coast. But it's happening on every continent. And all these grassroots alliances are growing and popping up, and it's such a fight. It's and so necessary, and still, you know, the corporate power that's amassed globally.
If I might just be permitted here, just perhaps to put this in a little wider perspective, if you don't mind, we should talk about capitalism just a little bit here.
Yeah.
I mean, well, I mean,
take it away, Steve.
It's been very well known. I mean, it was certainly commented on by Marx and by Engels and by a number of other people that the first stage of capitalist production was to remove people from the land, was to take people who were able to subsist upon the land itself and remove them from that land and to put them into cities where they were then dependent upon the wages provided by the capitalists, and they would of course work in his factories for that wage. And, you know, one theme I keep coming back to all the time is, you know, we don't just have an ecological crisis here, we have an economic crisis.
Oh, yeah.
And I wouldn't pretend that overthrowing capitalism is anything that's going to happen within our lifetimes of anyone here. But I think we need to question a lot of the assumptions here. And, you know, to bring it back to religion again, you know, I'll say this, being an Episcopalian, you know, the Episcopal Church is part of the Anglican Communion. Anglicanism began in England in the 16th century. So, you know, the origins of my own faith tradition go back to about the time that capitalism as we know it started. And in some respects, my faith tradition and many prominent people in it have supported the assumptions of the capitalist economy quite wholeheartedly. And I can't run away from that kind of history. Now, the kinds of things that you're talking about, Sharon, going on up in the Pacific Northwest, and that you were also talking about BrightFlame, I mean, I think that this is the kind of pushback against the assumptions of an extractive economy that looks to take what is in the earth as an object that can be commodified and sold for money elsewhere. And people are pushing back against that. And it's coming from certainly not just religious people, but it's coming from religious communities. So that's my little spiel about capitalism for now.
That makes me think of something Sharon said earlier about the discomfort that the left has. Environmentalists are in the left. You know, we may not have been in the 60s, but we are now. The discomfort with spirituality and religion. With one major exception, which you had mentioned, which is Native American. You know, if you're in a meeting and you're discussing capitalism or the government or pollution or corporate irresponsibility, whatever, nobody wants to talk about religion or spirituality unless somebody brings up something Native American, a quote from a Native American elder or something. Suddenly that wisdom, everybody's like, yeah, that's it. And yet, whatever religious background they personally have, they won't mention at the meeting, or they've squelched it inside of them or something. And yet, of course, we're in America, so maybe, you know, that's the best tradition to have, is one that started here. I don't know. I don't know what it's like in Europe. Are they quoting, you know, the indigenous Europeans of centuries ago? And your comment about the history of the Anglican Church. And so I'm wondering how this all comes together. It sounds like there's something, because it's all come up in this short conversation we've had today.
I see there's a lot of breaking down of walls, and that really appeals to me. You know, it's like the Berlin Wall is coming down in all different kinds of ways in all different kinds of places. You know, for example, I know Native Americans that are Christians.
Right? Yes.
You know,
yes.
and their people suffered a lot under Christianity, and in, you know, really, really devastating ways. But they are Christians. But they also have their tribal, you know, their indigenous, their practices. You know, and they're in harmony with that. That works. You know. Wangari Maathai, who was, you know, she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2004. Unfortunately, she passed away from cancer a couple of years ago at the age of 71, way too young. She, you know, was a woman from Kenya, first African woman, first environmentalist to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and she was Christian. You know, and she has this very deep connection to the earth, and her whole life is about planting trees for peace, for people to be able to grow peaceful communities through having a harmonious environment and having food and being self-sustaining. You know, so there's a lot of harmony here.
Yeah, I've been noticing the way in which we as a church are going to need, in my view, to have a kind of more porous kind of affect to the outside world if we're going to survive. That's my view. And I think that, you know, these big, beautiful edifices that were built 100 years ago and more are not a sustainable kind of place to be unless more people can come in who are not necessarily completely lined up with every kind of theological idea that historically has been in that edifice. So it's kind of a vague idea, but it's one that I think if churches can become kind of spiritual community centers, that doesn't mean that the traditional church services shouldn't continue to be existing in some way, shape, or form. And anyway, it's not up to me to decree what's going to happen. It's just that I was having a conversation with a woman the other day. She wanted to be there at church. She came to the coffee hour, but she said, well, I can't join because I don't believe in God. And I said, oh, but you want to be here because you like the work that's going on here, and you like the peace and the sense of community. Yeah, I get it. So again, I'm in favor of a more porous kind of approach to church.
Amen.
We're watching birds flying back and forth. That's why the window is birds agree.
I just want to be sure that everyone who's watching the show is aware of the Our Voices campaign. It's a campaign that has been organized by GreenFaith and by Conservation International, which is a UK nonprofit. The Our Voices campaign is an attempt at an ongoing worldwide interfaith climate effort following last September's People's Climate March. We are campaigning in an ongoing way for a sustainable climate treaty ultimately to come out of the UN meeting in Paris in December of 2015. Again, it's called Our Voices, and please go to the website, which is ourvoices.net, and register, and you can keep up with them. Thanks.
Now, I would like people to know about a couple things. One thing that's been on my mind a lot over quite a number of years now is how, what is it in us that disconnects us from being part of this ecosystem? Why do environmental educators have to kind of twist themselves inside out to try to get people to care about the systems that support our lives? And so my partner and I wrote a show back in 2002 called Penguins on Thin Ice. And one of the songs in it is called The Balance, and it just asks this question: how do we find the balance? Oh. It just asks this question: how do we find the balance?
Why don't you go ahead and sing it for us?
I think I'll go ahead and do that. How do we find the balance? How do we find the key? Where would you look to find it? I want you to tell me. How do we find the balance? How do we level the scales? Think about the animals, from the frogs to the whales, and then tell me what you think. Take time and think hard. Think about what life is like beyond your own backyard. How do we find the balance? How do we find the key? So in doing this work and learning a lot, connecting a lot of dots, realizing how politics and the environment and human health and well-being and absolutely everything, and social justice, everything is completely interconnected. I've been following, this jobs versus environment issue, which is being addressed in this country, but there's still a lot of kind of controversy, jobs versus environment, where we really need to be working together to create jobs that are good for people, good for the planet, and are also living wage jobs. And so one of the things I'm promoting is energy efficiency, because we can cut our energy use in half, and use renewables. And I just imagine the many thousands and possibly even over 1 million jobs that would be created in energy efficiency if we were to do energy retrofitting of every home, school, house of worship, and business in this country at a living wage. Has to be a living wage. you know, just imagine how many people we could train. We'd need some kind of a retraining program, something along the lines of the GI Bill, you know, which is well organized. You can call it a just transition program, transitioning people to this type of really sustainable work that would just transform our country. And, you know, it can't be an either or. It can't be jobs versus environment. It has to be, you know, creating these kinds of jobs for the 21st century. And why don't we hear more of our elected representatives talking about how we're going to create these jobs?
Yeah. The lack of political will goes back to the corporate and money that's in politics and policy making in this country and a lot of other countries that have greater influence on climate and other aspects of justice around the world. So, you know, I hear you what you said. I wanted to just mention a website that I just learned about. There are a lot of different groups now publishing in different ways the frontline stories, the people whose lives have been turned upside down by the extractive industries, for instance. So there's a website called friendsoftheharmed.org, I guess, and that's just one example of a group that's putting together stories of people who've been affected by fracking. These are people who maybe weren't against fracking to begin with, and then wells went in right around their property or on their property, and now they have health issues, and now they have no value of their home and land any longer.
Yeah, just, you know, where people of faith are talking about these issues, and it really is a moral issue if you want to look at it in that way. And I think some people don't want to, because then you have to take responsibility. Once you realize that you and everybody else needs to do something, you know, that becomes, oh, you know, then you have to actually do something, and you have to step out of your comfort zone and do something. But I just don't see how we can do this unless we all do it as you know, one large community. You know, I heard politicians saying, you know, back more than 10 years ago, oh, we can't afford to deal with climate change. And my response is, how can we afford not to? How can we afford not to? It's already cost so much money and so many lives, you know. And why aren't we employing the solutions? I would like to see a carbon tax. I think we need a carbon tax. I think we need to go there. I think we need to not be afraid of saying the word tax.
Yeah, when we're talking about science and religion, I interview a lot of scientists in the course of Ecologic, and I'll add, and one of my regular questions when we talk about endangered species, for example, is why should we care? I mean, really, why should we care? Why do you care? And I remember interviewing two herpetologists about frogs. And one of them, English was his second language, and he did much less of the talking than the other guest. When I asked that question, he got so fired up, because it's not an economic argument, it's not a scientific argument, it's a moral argument. They were put here by God, and we don't have the right to kill them. It's that simple. And I remember the other scientists looking at him like, whoa, you know, where did you come from? You never quite seen him that way. But I find scientists can be very, very eloquent on spiritual questions like that. And it's wonderful, because I'll be at a press conference at the Museum of Natural History, and I'll ask, well, why should we care? And he doesn't know how to answer it. And he looks over to the press person, am I allowed to answer a question like that? And they go, yeah, go ahead and answer it. And I'll say, you know, some of those eloquent answers have come right from this institution. And suddenly the guy will be eloquent, you know, once he's unleashed. It's people feel that they're not allowed to either be religious and scientific, or scientific and religious. Like, you have to separate them. And it's like, well, both of those are in you. You don't think they're not in other people? You know, but people separate.
I'm encouraged by hearing a lot more about the intrinsic value of nature and the rights of nature. You know, I mean, we're learning about our relationship to the whole planet, and you know, what is the lungs of the earth, and water doesn't stay in one place, and what goes through the water from one continent to another continent, and you know, we're starting to see these relationships, and I like to see us looking at them with a sense of curiosity and wonder and going, wow.
Yeah.
I really appreciate having that deeper understanding of how things are working here and how the planet is serving me in the Amazon or whatever, you know. One of the things, by the way, I just want to say about, we're talking about the real cost of things, you know, or when I say, you know, I think that we should have a carbon tax. We have never really looked at the real cost of what these forms of extractive energy, fossil fuel energies, we do not calculate the real costs to society, to human health and well-being. So once we start doing that, we're going to see a very different financial picture.
And I just want to put the we in what you just said back in the right place. Like in the People's Climate March, the narrative that we put out, there was a whole section of the narrative about who is responsible. And we grassroots level people know what the cost is. And there's so much money behind the corporations trying to diffuse the issue and mislead about the cost, you know, all the way from hiring advertising agencies and PR firms that to make sure we are not looking in the right place to put costs on things, you know, and to reframe the arguments the way they want to reframe it. But it goes back to political will again. It's not that we, people who love the earth and we know the interconnectedness of the ecosystems we rely on, and why the frogs need to be there because they're part of the ecosystem, not only because it's immoral to wipe them out and let them die. You know, we know what the costs are, but we don't have the money, nor should we as the individuals be charged with coming up what the costs are. You know, it's the industry and the policymakers who are hoisting these things on us who should be charged with coming up with that. And they won't unless we stay in the streets.
And we're involved, whether we like it or not. We're involved in one way or another. You know, the investments in any kind of investment is, you know, one way that so many of us are involved. You have a 401k. You know, what are you depending on to be profitable so that you have your retirement funds? You know, we have to start looking at these things and shifting what we're investing in. You know, well, how am I personally involved? Well, for one thing, I mean, federal subsidies that go to the fossil fuel industries, the nuclear industry, whether they want to admit it or not, because I had somebody from the IAEA tell me to my face they don't get any subsidies. But you know, those federal subsidies are our tax dollars. So we really should be up in arms about where our tax dollars are going. And, you know, also in terms of what we're doing, you know, I'm driving a car. How am I contributing to the problem? But it's not just about me not driving a car. It's about the collective action. It's about pushing on the political level. I remember back when I started giving talks on climate change in 2000, we were saying, you know, guys, if you change your light bulbs, that's just awesome. You know, the little things to the big things. And it's still, you still need to change your light bulbs. I mean, that hasn't gone away. But what we've come to over the years, after all the inaction, has been, okay, we really need to work on a much more aggressive and massive scale now. We have to be getting involved in the political process. We have to be pushing our electeds and electing new people.
You know, the problem is any sane person, and by sane person I mean the people who have similar beliefs as we really don't want to be in politics because it's crazy, but we need to start getting some people together who will get into that political system and become viable candidates, because that's how those who uphold high corporate and high capitalist profit-making kind of societies do it.
Yeah. I have a very simplistic question that I always wonder about. Don't the fossil fuel company executives have children and grandchildren? What are they saying to themselves? Literally, that's my question.
I've wondered that all the time. I don't understand it.
Yeah.
I think it goes back to telling ourselves stories. You know, we all tell ourselves stories. I'm a good person because I do this and I do that. You know, we all want to, I think it's possible that we all want to think we're doing the right thing. I mean, I think I'm doing the right thing, while somebody else thinks I'm not doing the right thing. You know, I'm pointing the finger at somebody and saying that person is, you know, evil. And by that, I mean, you know, lack of conscience. Just lack of conscience, you know, or maybe sociopath or whatever. But, you know, but somebody's pointing a finger at me and saying the same thing, you know. So what are we, you know, it's like, don't believe everything you think. That's a good lesson for all of that. I know a teacher, a high school biology teacher that has that bumper sticker in his classroom, don't believe everything you think. And we all need to check ourselves. Am I really saying something that's true, or am I just attached to my story? Well, I think that's going on for a lot of people, and people's beliefs tend to be tied to their income, you know?
But it turns out climate change isn't something you either believe in or you don't. It's sort of, it's the science, you know? It's 97%, and I don't even believe that. I believe it's more like 99%. There I go with belief. But is it really 3% of scientists who don't believe climate change is either happening or is human caused? I doubt it. Well, whether it's 3% or 1%, it's a big number, 97%.
Plus,
So-
I don't buy that all the people who keep their money in and their industry in and make decisions about, for instance, the energy production, that they really believe, oh, it's not harmful. I think they know damn well it's harmful, and what drives them, their belief is that if I have enough money, these things won't affect me, and they won't affect my grandchildren, you know. At some level they don't care, because just amassing the money is enough, and that's what they want to do, that's what they've been charged with doing.
I would just add one little idea to the mix here. You know, I think it's tremendously important for part of our political activity, even if it's just a little part of it, to be directed to overturning the Citizens United decision the Supreme Court made. And this is something that is almost never mentioned in any kind of environmental discussion at all. But I think quite arguably the biggest difference that any of us out there, including everybody, could make environmentally would be to overturn that decision.
I would like to say yes, and going beyond overturning that decision as well, because we had serious campaign finance problems even before Citizens United. That made that problem go on, you know, steroids.
Right.
But I would say we need to overturn Citizens United, and then we need.
Okay, we better explain what Citizens United is.
Oh, okay. Well, it was the decision made by the Supreme Court that allowed unlimited corporate or big money spending in elections for, I guess it's advertising, mainly is the thing.
And
but
campaign donations.
And also campaign donations. So whereas, you know, there were limits on campaign spending and states had their own limits, now that's all gone, and it's just, you know, money is considered free speech. Corporate entities have the same rights as natural persons, and none of us individuals can be represented that way. It's just not going to work. We have to get that money out of the elections process. We have to get our representatives out of the pockets of big industries and big money.
I mean, polluters will spend $1 million to put a candidate favorable to pollution in office when there's a candidate when there's already somebody in office who's against pollution. And and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Right. But an awful lot of times that $1 million works, especially in the local election, where the local candidate, you know, for some county office, if he's lucky, he can raise $100,000, and suddenly this guy has $1 million, and maybe the polluter candidate has been shown to be a really nasty person in many ways, he'll simply buy so much TV time showing him as a nice guy that people start to forget what they already knew about that person and the nasty things he had done in the past. So he's a nice guy. He won't actually support pollution. Oh, that's just something they're making up. And $1 million can actually buy enough TV time to sway people's minds. And that's why Citizens United is an environmental issue. Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought it up, Steve.
Because we shouldn't forget, too, in this context, that national polls repeatedly show that a majority of Americans support stronger environmental regulations. A majority of Americans believe that the Earth is growing warmer. They also, in most polls, also believe that the main cause is what humans are doing. So there is strong grassroots support for an environmental agenda. The problem is, Citizens United and the distortion of our political system that it brings about prevent the people's will from being acted on.
The last election, there were states that put anti-environmental candidates into office, but at the same time, there were ballot initiatives that were pro-environment that people voted for. So they voted for a person who was against the very thing that the very proposition they voted for. There's a very strange split personality going on in the electorate.
And we have our legislators allow groups like ALEC, which I forget what that acronym stands for, but
That's the American Legislative Exchange Council.
right, which is a rather benign sounding acronym and name to be misleading because it's controlled by very right-wing people who are totally against environmental types of legislation and totally for the most profit making that they can have and totally for conservative social issues as well. They draft legislation and the staffers and our Congress and our state legislators say, oh, okay, you want that passed? I don't have anything better, or sure, you're giving me lots of money, I'll put that in the mix.
And I see we really need to be talking about these things in our congregations and in our communities because the language, the political language has gotten so polarizing that we don't talk to each other, you know, and if we do, we don't talk about religion and politics. And these are things we really need to be talking about because especially, you know, the politics, and so we know that religion sometimes plays into that. If we're not talking and giving each other reality checks and sharing information, then that's how the corporations win. It's divide and conquer. And that's what's been going on in this country for a long time. We have a big country. We don't know each other. So, of course, we don't trust each other because we don't know each other. But when Rabbi Lerner was traveling around the U.S., and he would interview people on the East Coast and West Coast, and he would ask them, you know, what kind of a world do you want to see? Do you want to see a world of environmental sanity and love and kindness and generosity and people helping people in community? And they'd say, yes, of course. But those people in middle America, they'll never go for that, you know? And then he would go to a place like Kansas and, you know, and talk with some denomination or other and ask them the same questions. They say, of course we want that. But those people on the coast, they're so self-centered, they never go for that. You know, so we need to be knowing each other. We need to be talking together. And you know, the beauty of the technology we have is we can do that without burning a lot of fossil fuels. You know?
That's right.
I'm relying on all of you in the Abrahamic faith traditions to get out there and bring it to your congregations and let that ripple out through this whole country in the churches, temples, mosques, what have you, to educate people about all this stuff, about the political, about environmental. Because for the most part, not all witches are environmentalists, I have to say, but for the most part, in my pagan tradition, we are. So I'd be preaching to the choir, so to speak, you know, bringing, you know, even though I do bring that into my spiritual teaching, but you know, I want to see this stuff out rippling through America and Canada and Australia and the UK and wherever in those Abrahamic religious institutions. I'm counting on you.
It's an ongoing struggle, I can tell you.
Well, I want to thank you guys for being on this environmental forum. I think it was wonderful. I think every time I view it, I'm probably going to get something more out of it than the last time, because there was so much information and so much heart in what you were saying. And one more time, introductions.
Beth Ackerman, Riverside Church, Beloved Earth Community.
Steve Knight, Church of the Holy Trinity, Episcopal, Manhattan, and a GreenFaith fellow.
Bright Flame, a teacher, priestess, and writer, and activist in the reclaiming tradition of witchcraft.
And Sharon Abreu, a member of Tikkun and Network of Spiritual Progressives and Executive Director of Earthlings, Arts-Based Environmental Education, on the web at irthlingz.org, and also climatemonologues.com.
And I'm Ken Gale. I do Ecologic on WBAI FM on alternate Tuesdays. You can hear on the web at wbai.org. And thank you, Environment TV. And tell your friends to check out Environment TV. There are so many great things, from rallies to forums. A wonderful website, and more people need to know about it. So thank you for viewing. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
Yes.